On the cold evening of March 28, 1757, the streets of Paris echoed with screams, not of a mob, not of a battle, but of a single man. His name was Robert-François Damiens. His crime? An attempted assassination of King Louis XV. His punishment? A death so gruesome, so orchestrated, that even hardened executioners shuddered. He would not simply die. He would be unmade, his flesh ripped apart by horses, his body dismembered piece by piece, his very existence erased in agony. This is the story of Damiens, the man, the crime, the trial, and the death that shook France. A death that symbolized both the terrifying power of monarchy and the beginning of its downfall. In the chill of January 1757, the streets of France carried a silence broken only by whispers of discontent. The kingdom of Louis XV was vast, glittering, and yet deeply fragile. Behind the golden mirrors of Versailles lay a nation burdened by hunger, taxes, and despair. The poor starved while nobles feasted. The clergy preached of God's will, while filling their coffers with the offerings of those who had nothing left to give. And in this unequal world, one man, unremarkable in birth, unstable in mind, restless in spirit, would carry out an act that would etch his name in the darkest pages of history. His name was Robert-François Damiens. His crime, daring to draw blood from the king. His punishment, a death so unimaginable, so cruel, that even centuries later, it stands as one of the most brutal executions ever witnessed. Robert-François Damiens was born in Arras in 1715, a child of modest means. From boyhood, he earned a reputation for being reckless, ill-tempered, a man difficult to control. Some called him Robert the Devil, not for greatness in crime, but for his restless violence, his inability to stay at peace with work, with family, with the world. He wandered through jobs, a soldier for a time, a servant in wealthy households, a man always on the margins, never rising, never finding a place where he could settle. What burned within him was not brilliance, but bitterness, a discontent that festered in the heart of a man who believed himself wronged by society. By the 1750s, France was a kingdom stretched thin. The wars of Louis XV had drained the treasury. Taxes weighed heavily on the poor, while the privileged classes enjoyed exemption. The people's faith in their monarch had begun to falter. Louis, once hailed as a beloved, had become distant, notorious for his mistresses, his indulgence, his courtly extravagance. Yet still, in the eyes of the law, he was more than a man. He was the living embodiment of the state, the vessel of divine authority. To touch him, to wound him, was to strike at God himself. Damiens was no great conspirator. He did not belong to a movement, nor did he have powerful allies whispering in his ear. His mind, fractured and unstable, was filled with fragments of resentment. He claimed to act out of duty, out of warning, out of some confused desire to remind the king of his obligations. But the manner of his act, clumsy and unplanned, reveals not the hand of a plotter, but of a desperate, broken man. And yet, his small knife would open not only the side of the king, but the door to one of the most terrifying spectacles in French history. It was the evening of January 5th, 1757. At Versailles, the king prepared to depart in his carriage. Courtiers crowded around, guards stood at attention, the air thick with ceremony. Among the throng stood Damiens, his eyes fixed on a man who embodied all he resented. Concealed beneath his coat was a folding knife, no larger than that carried by any ordinary peasant. It was not a weapon of war, but of a kitchen of daily use. And yet, in his mind, it became the tool with which he would carve his name into eternity. As Louis stepped forward, Damiens lunged. The blade struck the king's side, piercing his flesh. The wound was shallow. Blood flowed, but not enough to bring death. The king staggered, gasped, but did not fall. Guards seized the assailant at once. Cries rang through the courtyard, an attack upon the king, an unthinkable crime. The crowd surged in fury, beating Damiens as they dragged him away. Louis, shaken but alive, returned quickly to his chambers. Within days he was healed. But the wound was less important than the act itself. For a subject to raise a hand against the king was not a personal assault. It was treason. It was sacrilege. It was the tearing of the bond that tied the nation to its ruler. And for this, There could be no ordinary punishment. Damiens was thrown into prison, his body chained, his flesh already bruised from the beating of guards and crowds. The interrogations began immediately. Authorities demanded to know, was he part of a plot? Was there a conspiracy? Did enemies of France send him? Damiens confessed, then contradicted himself, then confessed again to other details. His words spiraled, confused, incoherent. Sometimes he spoke of religious duty, sometimes of personal grievance, sometimes of corruption in court. Under torture, he admitted everything and nothing. What became clear was this: there was no vast conspiracy. There was only Damiens, a solitary man, reckless enough to stain royal flesh with a peasant's knife. But truth was not what mattered. Symbolism mattered, and the king's blood had been spilled. In such a crime, the punishment had to terrify, to remind every subject of France that the king's body was sacred, untouchable, that those who dared to harm it would suffer a fate worse than death. And so the court pronounced its judgment. Robert-François Damiens was sentenced to die, not by hanging, not by beheading, but by the ancient and terrible punishment reserved for regicides. His flesh was to be torn with red-hot pincers. Boiling lead, burning resin, and molten oil would be poured into his wounds. Then his arms and legs would be tied to horses, pulling until his body was torn apart. At last, what remained of him would be cast into fire, his ashes scattered to the wind. This was not justice. This was theater, a ritual of terror, meant to bind the people again to their king through fear. And so the date was set. On March 28, 1757, the Place de Grève in Paris would become the stage. Thousands would gather. Soldiers would line the square. Executioners, hardened by years of death, would prepare their tools. And in the center, one man would be broken, piece by piece, until nothing remained but ashes. His name would be remembered, not for his life, but for the manner of his end. Robert-François Damiens, the last man in France to be executed by the tearing of limbs, would be unmade before the eyes of the nation. March 28, 1757. The day dawned gray over Paris, a sky heavy with clouds that seemed to mirror the mood of the city. Long before the appointed hour, crowds began to fill the Place de Grève, the great square where executions were staged. Merchants abandoned their stalls. Beggars crept from the alleys. Nobles in fine carriages rolled up to secure a vantage point. Soldiers lined perimeter, their muskets ready, their orders clear. Maintain order, for today was not an ordinary execution. Today was to be a spectacle of loyalty, a warning carved into the flesh of a man for all to see. At the heart of the prison, Damiens waited. For weeks, he had been chained, tormented by the knowledge of what awaited him. He had been tortured already. His body burned, his skin flayed, his bones battered by the endless cruelty of interrogators. He had screamed, prayed, and muttered incoherently, sometimes begging for death, sometimes claiming innocence, sometimes declaring he had only wished to warn the king. But the sentence was sealed, and no plea could change it. Today he would walk, or be dragged, to the place where the full measure of royal vengeance would fall upon him. The executioners prepared their instruments. Heavy iron pincers were heated in braziers until they glowed red. Cauldrons of boiling oil, resin, and molten lead bubbled, their fumes rising acrid into the air. Ropes were measured and tied. The horses readied, their hooves restless upon the cobblestones. Charles-Henri Sanson, the royal executioner of Paris, a man whose family had for generations carried out the crown's punishments, stood grim-faced. He had seen death in every form, hangings, beheadings, burnings. But what he was ordered to do today weighed upon him more than any other task. Even he, hardened by years of duty, would later admit that the execution of Damiens was almost too much to bear. As the hour approached, the condemned was brought forth. His body was weak, trembling, his flesh already marked with wounds from torture. His clothes were torn, his hair disheveled, his face pale and gaunt. Yet he was not yet broken. Some witnesses would later record that his eyes, sunken though they were, still held flashes of defiance, as though even at the edge of annihilation, some corner of his soul refused to surrender. Others said he looked more like a man already dead, a shell moving forward only because he was forced. Dragged into the square, Damiens was tied to a wooden frame. The crowd erupted in shouts, curses, and jeers. Mothers held their children aloft to see the traitor's fate. Nobles leaned forward from carriages to catch every detail. Priests muttered prayers, while philosophers in the crowd watched with cold detachment, seeing in this theater of cruelty the truth of absolute monarchy laid bare. The first stage began. Executioners took the glowing pincers and pressed them into Damien's flesh, his legs, his chest, his arms. With each bite of iron, pieces of skin and muscle tore away, sizzling as they fell. Damien screamed, a sound so raw that even some of the crowd recoiled. Again and again, the pincers closed, tearing him apart slowly, methodically, as the punishment decreed. Blood flowed freely, mixing with the smell of burning flesh. The air was thick with smoke and the stench of agony. Then came the second stage. Into the open wounds, the executioners poured boiling oil, melted wax, molten lead, and burning resin. Each substance seared his body, igniting fresh cries of pain. His body writhed against the ropes, but there was no escape. He begged for mercy, called upon God, cried out for death. But mercy was not part of this ritual. This was vengeance in its most ceremonial form. Hours seemed to pass, though in truth it was minutes. The crowd swelled, pressing closer, unable to look away. Some fainted, some laughed nervously, some wept. The executioners themselves, sweating and grim, carried on. At last, it was time for the final stage, the tearing of the body by horses. For great horses were brought forward, each attached to a limb. Ropes tightened around his wrists and ankles, each one secured to the harness of a waiting beast. At the signal, the whips cracked, and the horses surged forward. Damien screamed as his body stretched, his joints straining, his flesh tearing. But the body of man is stubborn, and it did not yield easily. Again the whips cracked. The horses pulled harder, straining against the resistance of muscle and sinew. His body arched, his screams rising above the roar of the crowd. Still he did not come apart. The executioners cursed. They adjusted the ropes, urged the horses again. Damien's arms and legs twisted grotesquely, his body stretching beyond natural limits. Bones cracked, flesh tore, and yet he clung stubbornly to life, as though even his body resisted annihilation. Witnesses reported that it took not 4 horses, but 6, then more, to finally rend his body asunder. Piece by piece, the limbs tore free, blood gushing onto the cobblestones. His cries faded into a final gasp, and then silence. What remained of him was cast into fire. His torso, mangled and broken, was thrown onto the flames. Ashes rose into the air, carried away by the wind, scattered so that no trace of him remained. The crowd, shaken, began to disperse. Some whispered that justice had been served. Others muttered that the spectacle had gone too far, that no crime, not even striking the king, deserved such torment. But all who witnessed it carried the memory, etched into their minds with fire and blood. The executioners, exhausted, left the square in silence. Even Sanson, who had ended countless lives, admitted that this was unlike anything before or since. It was as though the monarchy itself had poured all its fear, all its rage, into one man's destruction, hoping that by tearing him apart, it could stitch back together the torn fabric of loyalty. But in truth, the spectacle achieved something else. It revealed the monarchy's cruelty, its desperation, its willingness to destroy a man utterly, to preserve its sacred image. Philosophers who watched that day would write of it. Thinkers like Michel Foucault centuries later would analyze it, pointing to the execution of Damiens as the ultimate symbol of the old order, a world where power was not hidden, but written directly upon the body of the condemned. And so the Place de Grève emptied. The smoke drifted away. The cobblestones, still stained with blood, bore silent witness. Robert-François Damiens was no more, but his death, more than his crime, would be remembered. The last man in France to suffer such a fate, his execution marked both the height and the beginning of the decline of a system built on fear, spectacle, and absolute power. When the fires of the Place de Grève burned low and the crowd finally dispersed, Paris seemed to exhale a long, uneasy breath. The city had seen executions before, but none like this. For hours, thousands had stood transfixed, their eyes locked upon the tearing of man, their ears filled with his screams, their noses filled with the bitter stench of burning flesh. Now, as evening shadows fell across the square, silence crept through the streets, broken only by murmurs and the shuffling of feet. The name of Damien spread swiftly. Taverns buzzed with a retelling of what had been seen. Some recounted it with horror, unable to shake the sight of limbs stretched and torn, of molten lead poured into wounds. Others spoke with grim satisfaction, declaring that the punishment had been just, that the king's body was sacred, and that anyone who dared defile it must be destroyed completely. But beneath the surface, there was another reaction, one less spoken, more dangerous. A whisper that the punishment had been too much, that in killing one man so savagely, the monarchy had revealed its own brutality. Even among those who had long been loyal to the crown, unease spread. Priests reminded their flocks that treason against the king was treason against God. But philosophers, writers, and thinkers of the Enlightenment drew another lesson. They saw in Damien's execution not the majesty of justice, but the grotesque excess of a system built on fear. They saw a monarchy so desperate to assert its divinity that it resorted to tearing apart the body of a frail, unstable man. In letters, diaries, and pamphlets, accounts circulated. Some described the execution in gruesome detail, their words dripping with the spectacle of pain. Others attempted to analyze it, to strip away the horror and expose the truth. In the salons of Paris, intellectuals debated not only the crime, but the punishment. Was such cruelty necessary? Could authority not be maintained without fire, pincers, and horses? Each retelling, each debate weakened the sacred aura of the monarchy, pulling it down from divine heights into the mud and blood of human cruelty. For the royal court, however, the message was clear. The punishment had been designed to terrify, to remind the people that the king's life was not simply that of a man, but of a sacred figure whose body represented the state itself. By tearing apart Damiens, they sought to show that treason was not only futile, but carried a cause so terrible no one would dare repeat it. Yet the very extremity of the punishment had the opposite effect. Instead of awe, it inspired revulsion. Instead of obedience, it planted the seeds of doubt. Those who had been present at the execution carried memories that haunted them. Mothers who had lifted children onto their shoulders now wondered what lessons those young eyes had absorbed. Soldiers who had stood guard admitted later that the cries of the condemned echoed in their ears long after. Even the executioners, hardened men whose lives were bound to death, were shaken. Charles Henri Sanson, who oversaw the ritual, confessed that never had he performed a duty so dreadful, so unbearable, as the destruction of Robert-François Damiens. As news of the execution spread beyond Paris, Europe reacted with shock. Courts in other kingdoms whispered of the savagery of France, of the cruelty inflicted upon a single man. In some capitals, it was whispered that such barbarity revealed weakness, not strength, that a monarchy secure in its authority did not need to dismember its enemies with such display. The philosophers of the Enlightenment, already challenging the old order of kings and priests, found in Damien's death a vivid example of what they argued against, a world where authority was maintained not through reason or law, but through public terror. Michel Foucault, centuries later, will begin his famous study of punishment with the execution of Damiens, not because the man himself was extraordinary, but because his death symbolized the essence of the old regime. It was punishment as theater, authority written upon the body, power displayed through pain. In the square of Paris, the monarchy had stripped away all pretense of mercy and revealed its heart. Rule through spectacle, obedience through fear. And once revealed, such a heart could not easily be hidden again. For the ordinary people of Paris, life returned quickly to its rhythms. The poor still begged. Merchants still sold bread and wine. Nobles still attended the king's court. But beneath the routine lay memory. The Place de Grève had drunk deeply of blood, and those who had stood upon its stones would never forget what they had seen. For some, it deepened fear of authority. For others, it sowed resentment. And in the years to come, as France staggered toward revolution, the memory of Damien's execution would resurface as proof of the cruelty of kings. The man himself was gone. His body burned, his ashes scattered. No grave left to mark his existence. Yet, paradoxically, this annihilation ensured his immortality. Robert-François Damiens, a restless, unstable servant who had never commanded power in life, became unforgettable in death. His attempt to strike the king had failed. His knife, had drawn only a shallow wound. But by enduring the most brutal punishment in French history, he became a symbol of cruelty, of spectacle, of a monarchy clinging desperately to power. And so the story of Damiens did not end with the scattering of his ashes. It lived on in whispers and writings in the hearts of those who had seen and those who had heard. His death, meant to erase him completely, instead ensured he would never be forgotten. He was the last man in France to be executed by tearing apart with horses, and in that finality lay his strange legacy. A man destroyed utterly, yet remembered eternally. The flames of Damiens' execution had long since died, but their smoke lingered over France, not in the air but in memory. What had been intended as a display of ultimate power had instead exposed something else, the fragility of a monarchy that required such terror to sustain itself. The spectacle at the Place de Grève revealed more than the crime of a man. It revealed the soul of a regime, one that ruled not with love nor with law, but with fear carved directly into human flesh. In the salons of Paris, where philosophers gathered to debate the nature of man and the purpose of government, the execution was discussed with fascination and disgust. The Enlightenment was already stirring. Men like Voltaire, Montesquieu, Rousseau, and Diderot were questioning the foundations of authority. They argued that kings were not divine, that men were born with natural rights, that justice must serve reason rather than vengeance. The death of Damiens provided them with an example too vivid to ignore. Here, before the eyes of thousands, the monarchy had shown its reliance on cruelty. Here, the so-called majesty of kingship had been reduced to horses tearing apart a broken servant. Some thinkers spoke cautiously, careful not to challenge the crown openly, but in their private writings and whispered conversations, they noted the irony. The act of single unstable man had been transformed into a theater of pain, yet the intended lesson, fear, was weakened by the excessive cruelty. Fear can control, but it can also revolt. And revolt begins not always in action, but in thought. Ordinary Parisians, too, carry conflicting feelings. For centuries, they had been raised to believe the king was sacred, his body inviolable. To see that body wounded was shocking, even if the wound was small. To see the response, however, forced them to confront the reality of royal justice. Was this the hand of a father guiding his children, or the hand of a tyrant crushing dissent? Many dared not speak the thought aloud, but the seeds were planted. Seeds that would take root over the next 3 decades, growing silently until they erupted in the great upheaval of 1789. The symbolism of Damiens' death extended far beyond the crime itself. His failed attempt at regicide might have been forgotten, one more petty act in a troubled kingdom. But the execution ensured immortality. It became a turning point, a marker in the history of punishment. For centuries, public executions have been staged not merely to kill, but to demonstrate. The scaffold was a theater where power was displayed. The crowd was not only witness, but participant, their gasps and cries part of the drama. But as the Enlightenment advanced, this theater grew less convincing. People began to ask, should justice not be about order, about correction, about fairness? Was pain truly necessary to prove the strength of law? What happened to Damiens became an example in these debates. His body, pulled apart in the square, stood as a symbol of the old world, of punishment as vengeance, of authority as spectacle. In time, reformers would point to his death as proof of why punishment must change, why justice must move from the public square into the prison, from torture into imprisonment, from the breaking of bones into the correction of souls. Damiens' agony became the fulcrum upon which a new vision of law began to turn. But in the immediate years that followed, the monarchy remained blind to this shift. Louis XV continued his reign, surrounded by courtiers and mistresses, insulated from the growing tide of discontent. He had survived the knife of Damiens, and perhaps he believed that the terrifying execution had secured his throne. Yet whispers grew louder. Pamphlets mocked his excesses. Plays satirized court, and philosophers spread ideas that questioned the very foundation of absolute rule. The monarchy had survived a wound to the king's body, but it had inflicted upon itself a deeper wound, a wound to its legitimacy. Europe watched. Other monarchies, absolute in their own realms, took note. Some admired the ruthlessness, believing that such cruelty preserved power. Others were disturbed. sensing that such spectacles weakened the image of majesty rather than strengthened it. The very violence meant to exalt the king instead made him appear fragile, desperate, human. And when kings appear too human, their divinity evaporates. Among the common people, the story of Damiens became distorted with retellings. Some claimed he had plotted with Jesuits. Others said he had acted alone. Some whispered that he had been driven mad by poverty and hunger in taverns. The tale grew in the telling, but always at its center was the same truth. A man had been torn apart by horses, his body burned, his ashes scattered, for striking the king. The crime might be debated, the motive argued, but the punishment was unforgettable. Children grew up hearing of it. Young men repeated it. Old men shook their heads and said they had seen it with their own eyes. The monarchy could erase Damien's body, but it could not erase memory. And in that memory lay danger. For once people begin to see cruelty not as justice, but as desperation, the power of fear weakens. Once the sacred image of the king is tarnished by the stench of burning flesh, respect is harder to demand. The road to revolution was still decades away, but already the stones were being laid. The Enlightenment's call for liberty and reason, the rising anger of the oppressed classes, the failures of monarchy, all converged. Damien's execution did not cause a revolution, but it stood as a symbol of what the revolution would rise against. When, in 1789, the Bastille was stormed and the monarchy trembled, some remember that bloody day in 1757 as one of the sparks that revealed the true face of royal power. Damiens himself had never intended such a legacy. He was not a visionary, not a martyr, not a leader. He was, in many ways, a lost man, angry, unstable, desperate. His knife had scratched the flesh of a king, but had failed to change the world. And yet, by the cruelty of his death, he became immortal, his name remembered long after kings and queens faded into history. Sometimes it is not the greatness of a life, but the brutality of a death that ensures remembrance. And so, when historians and philosophers look back upon the execution of Robert-François Damiens, they see more than a crime and a punishment. They see a mirror held up to an age, reflecting the contradictions of a kingdom glittering with wealth and rotting with injustice. They see a monarchy that revealed its fear by destroying one man utterly. And they see, in the tearing of a body, the unraveling of an old order that would, within a generation, collapse beneath the weight of its own cruelty. The ashes of Robert-François Damiens scattered to the wind, yet in their dispersal lay the strange immortality of his story. He had been reduced to nothing, yet his death became a lesson, a warning, and a mirror reflecting the brutality of power. Historians would remember him not for his life, but for the manner of his destruction. Philosophers would dissect it, asking why a state must resort to unimaginable cruelty, and what such acts say about justice, authority, and human nature. In the years that followed, the memory of Damiens' execution persisted in the culture of France. It became a cautionary tale whispered in taverns, recounted in pamphlets, and studied in the writings of scholars who sought to understand the mechanics of fear. The spectacle revealed the monarchy at its most desperate, displaying authority through pain, power through terror. Yet in doing so, it exposed its own vulnerability. For when a ruler must tear a man apart to demonstrate supremacy, it signals that legitimacy is fragile. All alone cannot sustain obedience. The philosophers of the Enlightenment seized upon this truth. Montesquieu, Voltaire, Rousseau, and their contemporaries argued that authority built on violence is inherently unstable. They asked whether law should correct or destroy, whether justice should elevate or terrify. Damiens' death became an emblem of the wrong path, a vivid proof that governance through spectacle leads not to respect, but to resentment. These ideas would spread far beyond France, shaping the thinking of reformers and revolutionaries alike. Even as France continued under the reign of Louis XV and later Louis XVI, the shadow of Damiens' execution lingered. The monarchy maintained outward splendor, yet beneath the glitter, the seeds of distrust and dissatisfaction had been sown. Ordinary citizens, having witnessed or heard of the spectacle, carried a dual memory, the horror of cruelty and the vulnerability of power. To some, the king was divine. To others, he was fallible, fearful, mortal. And it was in this fissure, between awe and doubt, that the revolution would find fertile ground decades later. Damiens himself became a symbol in ways he could never have imagined. He was not a hero in the traditional sense. He had neither vision nor ideology. Yet in the act of striking at the king and enduring the most extreme punishment, he transcended his ordinary existence. He became a figure through which questions about justice, morality, and authority could be explored. How far should a state go to punish transgression? How should power balance fear and reason? What does it mean for society when terror becomes performance? These were the questions Damiens' death forced upon the people of France and upon historians for centuries afterward. Modern observers, reflecting upon the execution, find lessons both grim and instructive. Damiens' death is a testament to the extremes of human cruelty and the lengths to which those in power will go to defend themselves. It is also a lesson in memory, that even a man utterly destroyed can leave an indelible mark on history. His suffering became a mirror, showing not only the brutality of punishment, but also the inherent weakness of a system that must resort to spectacle to maintain authority. In literature, in philosophy, in historical analysis, the execution is repeatedly invoked. It challenges notions of justice. It illuminates the psychology of fear and obedience. It raises the uncomfortable truth that societies often equate cruelty with control, only to find that cruelty corrodes trust, respect, and legitimacy. Damiens' tearing apart was meant to terrify, yet the horror of it invited reflection, analysis, and ultimately criticism, a far more lasting effect than the immediate fear it was designed to instill. And so, when we remember Robert-François Damiens today, it is not merely as a man who attempted to harm a king. We remember him as a human figure caught between despair and punishment, between ordinary life and extraordinary cruelty. His death encapsulates a moment in history when authority revealed itself in its rawest form, when the power of the monarchy was written in blood and fire. It is a reminder of the cost of fear, the spectacle of power, and the enduring questions about justice and human dignity. The Place de Grève has long since changed. Paris evolved. Kings fell, revolutions rose and passed. But the echoes of that day in 1757 linger. In every historical account, in every philosophical analysis of punishment, Damiens' story is retold, a testament to the extremes of human cruelty and the complexity of human society. His life may have been small, unremarkable, unstable, yet his death left a mark that no executioner, no fire, and no centuries could erase. In the end, the lesson is not simple. Damiens' execution warns of the dangers of absolute power and cruelty. It illustrates the fragility of fear as a tool of governance. It challenges us to consider what justice truly means. And above all, it reminds us that history is often written not only in victories and policies, but in suffering, the suffering of those crushed under the machinery of authority, yet remembered forever for the light their story casts on the human condition. The death of Robert-François Damiens remains, to this day, one of the most brutal, shocking, and consequential executions in history. It is a story of desperation, of terror, of spectacle, and of reflection. A story that teaches, horrifies, and resonates across centuries. A story that, in the tearing apart of one man, holds a mirror to the extremes of power, the consequences of cruelty, and the enduring quest for justice.